junior high, I moved to Spearfish and I started working restaurants there when I was only 13 years old. And I worked, up in Spearfish Canyon. I worked in Sylvan Lake, and I worked around Deadwood. We're on Spearfish, of course, and I just did that. And so after college, after Black Hills State, I moved to Minneapolis, became a chef at a pretty young age. And a few years into that chef career, I kind of had the epiphany of doing what I'm doing because I realized the absence of my culture in the culinary world, as there were no native restaurants. I couldn't find any cookbooks on the subject and things like that. So my focus really shifted towards just understanding what were Native American and indigenous foods in general in America. And it was a long journey because obviously I started this way back in probably 2000 and I want to say 2009 is when I kind of started researching really heavily. I'm trying to understand what this meant to me, and I finally formed my company, the Sous Chef, in 2014. But it took quite a few years of trying to understand. What were we eating as indigenous peoples? What were we harvesting? What were we gathering? What were we using for food preservation and culinary techniques, cooking techniques? What did we use for salts and fats and sugars? And just trying to understand like what was the whole system before European colonization, before European influence came about, and just trying to understand like how are we surviving for countless generations with what was out there, before we had modern conveniences and things like that. So as a young chef, I had a good career in the city, but this became really important to me. Like I just wanted to know why was my heritage left out of the conversation. So I formed the Sous Chef officially in 2014 with that focus. I developed a philosophy of in order to showcase indigenous foods. I basically cut out European influences. So I took away things that didn't exist here not that long ago. So I removed things like beef, pork, chicken, dairy, wheat flour, cane sugar, and just showcase that there was a whole bunch of really cool foods to play with outside of that. And this really took me into really explaining what I was doing because it was kind of a concept that people didn't really know because there were really no native restaurants out there. And because I had a philosophy of removing things like wheat flour, there was no fry bread in my cuisine, which is what most people associated Native American foods with. And so I started to learn how to articulate a lot about what were native foods, and especially to the press who were just asking lots of questions. And this turned into basically me becoming a presentation type person. So I give a lot of presentations to universities, to large conferences. I've been on a global scale. I've traveled around a lot to be able to do this work. And so there's a lot of interest. And I see this as a connection not only to us as Indigenous peoples in America, but basically across the globe. And so basically my work just turned into talking about colonization and explaining to people what colonialism is and why do we use terms like decolonize our diets and things like that. And it's not like we're trying to recreate the past and cook recipes that we would have found before European colonization. We're just trying to understand like what are the values, what are the knowledge bases of indigenous peoples that we could utilize today to make us all better and healthier, and really implement that into who and where we are today with all the knowledge that we already have, because there's a vast amount of indigenous education out there that was largely untapped, because indigenous peoples lived really closely with the world around us, understood like the connections to the plants and the resources around us and the environment and how to protect them and live really harmonically with everything around us. And so I talk about just what happened to us as indigenous peoples, not only here in America, but on a global scale during this time period. Really, and I really kind of just focus on the 1800s because, the United States has a very short history, and American colonization, starts in the very late 1700s. And, the United States government is a very short history in world history, starting in the late 1700s, like I said. But, even in the early 1800s, like the majority of what is North America was stewarded by indigenous peoples, and many indigenous peoples hadn't even seen European peoples in this time period of history. And so we just look at how fast things change for the indigenous peoples on these land spaces, in places like where I grew up. And we don't even really define the colonial borders that we know today as the US and Mexico until the middle of that century. during this, like right around the Civil War in the middle of the 1800s. And, so I just talk about like how aggressive the United States government was against indigenous peoples and the dehumanization that happened to us. Because really the only value we had as indigenous peoples in America was the land that we stood on, because the United States government discovered they could take over land spaces, commodify it, and basically make a lot of money by selling out all those portions. And that all stems from this ordinance called the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which basically makes our land spaces look like this. That's the manuscript that started this whole situation. So when you fly out over the western states and to the East Coast, and you look down and you see those perfect grids, that was a part of that, of just justifying these land stuff, justifying the land theft and then commodifying it. And so the history of the United States, if you look at what happened in just the century of 1800, and knowing that the large amount of this land space was stewarded by indigenous peoples from 1800, over 80%. And by the end of that one single century, less than 2% remains in indigenous land hands, only because of the reservation systems. So during this time, there's just a lot of aggression happening against indigenous peoples. There's a lot of violence happening. There's a lot of racism and xenophobia. There's a real big push for, colonization, which is just taking over land spaces and occupying it and just utilizing whatever natural resources are deemed value, whether it's lumber or mining or cattle ranching or whatever it might be. Places like California wipe out its entire population almost to completion within 2 decades. And so there's just a lot of history we don't learn about in America. Because like if we grow up in America, we just don't learn about like these other perspectives of history of things that happened to us. So a lot of my work has just been talking about like this perspective of history and the massive amount of land and seed and food destruction that happened to our food systems, knowing that there was really vast and just a lot of agriculture happening all over the board. The aggressiveness that starts at the very beginning with George Washington ordering General Sullivan basically to enslave and wipe out all the settlements in the East, which he basically does in a single summer in 1779. Where still today, in like Haudenosaunee language, the word for U.S. president still means town destroyer, literally, because of those histories. But we see many aggressions like the Homestead Act of 1862 and the Morrill Act of 1862, which creates land grant colleges, which a lot of land grant universities still benefit from a lot of these land spaces that were given to them in not so legal situations. We see the Dawes Act of 1887 and just all of this kind of justified violence that happens towards indigenous peoples during these time periods. And again, so much violent rhetoric against indigenous peoples. This is a flyer outside of Denver right before the Sand Creek Massacre, basically promising people if they sign up for the militia and go and fight, and then they could just keep whatever plunder they have. And those kinds of things happen all over the board, of course. So during this time period, there's just the massive amount of change that happens for indigenous communities who had been living within their cultures, these really diverse cultures all across North America for so long. And it's not hard to dig into history and see the intentionality of things like the destruction of bison coming from the U.S. government with the sole purpose of hurting the indigenous communities, much like ours of the Lakota and the Dakotas. But what was most damning for us was really just the loss of our own education systems, which is what we really try to put a lot of energy into, because my grandparents' generation at the end of that century, who should have been downloading countless generations of knowledge of how to identify plants, how to make medicine, how to cook food, how to find spices, how to preserve foods, how to cook foods, how to build tools and weapons and lodging, and all the histories and religion and myths and stories and all the things. All that comes to a screeching halt because of the assimilation efforts of the United States government, who basically strips a lot of our indigenous children forcibly, putting them into boarding schools, and then changes our education system completely by teaching us things that have nothing to do with who we are as indigenous communities. And this just brings a lot of trauma to a lot of these young children, because this picture has hundreds of children coming from many nations all across the United States. And, the reality is that these kids, this is a military run school system. This is at Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And then, these kids are subjected to all sorts of physical abuse, mental abuse, sexual abuse, and death. There's still a massive graveyard at the Carlisle Indian School that you could visit today that's just filled with indigenous children. these boarding schools pop up all over the United States, especially in areas where there's high densities of indigenous communities, which is kind of everywhere at that time period, all over the territories like Alaska, Hawaii, all over Canada, called residential schools. There's a really powerful movie called Sugarcane that's out on Netflix right now, or Hulu, I think maybe, but it's really intense. It talks about one particular community in British Columbia, and it's really worth watching to kind of see the pain that comes out of these things because we're subjected to completely different lifestyles, different languages, different religions. And, one of the punishments they gave these young kids when I visited, they said that if kids were taught speaking their own languages or singing their own the songs in their own languages, that they would force the kids to brush their teeth with pumice stones, for an example, or put them into solitary confinement. So it's just a really harsh thing when we're still reeling from trauma from this stuff in our communities. We're still dealing with a lot of domestic abuse and violence and drug abuse and sexual abuse and these things that stem directly from these traumas that are just handed down generation after generation. The 1900s is just another era of invisibility for us as Indigenous peoples. We're not, officially citizens until 1924 in America, which is well within my grandparents' era. And now like there was news of questioning Native citizenship in America just a few days ago. We see the Racial Integrity Act of 1924 to make sure that they can segregate us as Indigenous peoples because reservation systems are still segregated communities in America. And so we go through a couple decades of Indian termination and relocation policies and the Indian adoption era from 1941 to 1967, which is basically 3 decades, where that statistic is 1 out of 3 children, which is just think of 3 decades, 1 out of 3 children are pulled out of native homes and put into non-native homes. And then we can't vote until 1965 in South Dakota. Native communities couldn't vote until the 80s because of they wouldn't accept votes from unorganized counties, which meant the native counties. And we still have a hard time getting votes out there because of the gerrymandering that happens and other issues. Couldn't celebrate our own religions freely until 1978, and a lot of our community knowledge holders were locked away, if not beaten or even unalived during those time periods. So it was really dangerous to be a knowledge holder of Indigenous peoples up until, even still today, but especially before it was actually illegal to celebrate our cultures into the late 70s, which is in my lifetime. And the purpose of talking about that history is just showcasing like we really haven't even had a chance to catch our breath, let alone open up a bunch of restaurants across the United States. And so that's a big reason like we have to understand history of why things are like they are, especially in tribal communities and reservation systems, why we have awful statistics of type 2 diabetes and heart disease and obesity. And it's all because of this food access. It's all because of this trauma. It's all because of this really violent history that happened against us. So when I was growing up, this was typical food for me. It wasn't this beautiful indigenous foods that we celebrate at the restaurant and stuff in Minneapolis today. We grew up in a very colonized, segregated community on the reservation system. And I largely grew up with commodity food program foods coming out of the USDA, which had nothing to do with our cultures and really contributes to a lot of the health issues we have today because of, getting us addicted to really bad diets, a lot of empty white carbs and a lot of fruits with packed in sugars and a lot of vegetables packed in sodiums. And great that we have food to be able to survive, yes, but we could do a lot better. And that's kind of the purpose of the work that we do. And when I was growing up, we just had basic things like these cans of beef with juices and chicken with juices and all this stuff from the USDA. And you really couldn't distinguish this stuff from dog food and cat food. It's not good stuff at all but this was dinner a lot of times. So in order to understand indigenous food systems, you really just have to understand the diversity of North America, which is extremely diverse because it's a massive continent. And one way to look at the indigenous diversity is you can look at language maps, and these are very generalized because there's a lot of different kinds of cultures and other languages and dialects amongst these huge color groups. But you can see this diversity and just imagine like what would it be like to travel across the nation, stopping at indigenous restaurants and featuring a lot of the regional indigenous diversity that's out there through food systems, wild foods, agriculture, and wild game, and so forth. And so there's a lot of indigeneity in North America with, over 600 tribes in Canada, 574 in the US, and over 20% of Mexico identifying as indigenous. And it just doesn't, there's no comparison to colonial settler states and indigenous territories. And it doesn't matter who's speaking Spanish, English, or French. Those are all European colonial languages, and those are all foreign languages on this land space. So it's really important to understand like where we are and what do we really have to like what do we really have to learn here in America today? So Indigenous education for us is really important because Indigenous education covers all of these topics, you know. And we should be not forcing, we should be creating a lot of access to Indigenous education because it gives us a lot of education around the world around us, what we could utilize for the plants and the trees and the roots and the flowers and the animals. And there's just so much to learn from how Indigenous peoples were surviving really symbiotically and resourcefully with what's around us and showcasing all this really beautiful diversity that's out there. And so there's so many foods that come out of the Americas that have been normalized across the world, and that's what's exciting. And this is just a small list, you know. This is just a tiny list of things that come out of North America, and the Western diet's largely ignored. Basically, most of the foods that come out of the Americas, except for key pieces, which have become now global phenomena, and are utilized everywhere. And there's massive benefits for indigenous diets because, you know, for our philosophy of cutting away dairy, flour, cane sugar, beef, pork, chicken, like if you go to our restaurant in Minneapolis, everything's dairy free, sugar free, soy free, pork free, gluten free. And it's just like really, really healthy food base, you know. So we celebrate a lot of protein diversity. We buy a lot of bison from Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe there in South Dakota. We showcase all sorts of things from the West Coast and East Coast. And we even have insects on the menu because insects were normal protein choices for many people, and they still are in many places around the world, like this space in Oaxaca and Mexico and southern Mexico. I talk a lot about wild plants. I talk about the benefits of understanding all these wild plants around us and how we can really learn a lot more by understanding plants. So there's just so much amazing diversity. And like, you know, growing up in the Black Hills, like not only did you have this little mountainous area with a lot of conifers all around you, with different kinds of plants growing up in the hills, but then you also had the grasslands right next to you, which was a completely different ecosystem. And then you even had the Badlands, which is another complete different ecosystem. And when you learn a lot about ethnobotany and the plants around us and how they were utilized by the indigenous communities, like there's so much to learn because these plants give us everything, you know. So we should really be putting a lot of education into all of these wild plants, and we should be really just helping these plants grow, these food plants especially, because we could be creating a whole bunch more pantry items just by, you know, utilizing our land spaces better, getting rid of lawns and stuff like that. Timsala, the wild prairie turnip, used to be such, you know, so much of it out there across the Dakotas because it basically grew above the Dakotas into parts of Canada and all the way down into Texas. And it just thrived, especially wherever the bison were roaming. But once the bison removed and indigenous peoples removed, it's become really sparse and hard to find. It's still out there, but not the way it used to be. And there's other staples out there that other indigenous communities had, like camas throughout the Pacific Northwest, California, wild rice here in the Great Lakes, or, you know, if you lived in coastal areas, just the knowledge of plants in general out there in the oceans or the deserts, which grow so much amazing stuff. We talk a lot about agriculture because, you know, this is the world we live in today, but we also know this is very dangerous, and we don't know what microdosing glyphosate's actually going to do to us after doing that for 20 years, but we're going to have no choice but to find out. So it's really important for us to think about like how did indigenous peoples utilize agriculture and just understanding how vast it was, because this is a map of everywhere that agriculture was found before Europeans show up and was flourishing even. And so like this is just a massive area of North America into that goes all the way into South America that indigenous agriculture was happening, growing things like corns and beans and squash and chilies and sunflowers and all sorts of things, you know, including tobacco. And you can trace indigenous histories of agriculture from Mexico all the way up into the Americas. This is New Mexico. This is a styling in the East Coast. This is Buffalo Bird Woman, who's Hidatsa up in the Missouri River Valley, growing the same things that they were deep into Mexico. You know, just different varieties of things that change slightly over time. But understanding the importance of heirloom seeds and trying to source a lot of indigenous heirloom seeds out there. So I spent a lot of my work looking for indigenous seed keepers and trying to find out who's growing these amazing foods and just talking about their stories who have these deep connections to these amazing biodiversity that's you know, in extreme danger still today, and how we should be really focused on stewarding this and making sure that indigenous communities have a huge opportunity of growing and maintaining and sustaining a lot of these biodiverse pieces out there. in the world today. So our work is just trying to understand how do we take all of that knowledge and do something with it today. So we just really believe that if we could change the way people think about food, especially regionally, and showcase the importance of understanding indigenous, because again, like there's all these benefits of indigenous diets out there. And so when we started our work, we just started getting people outside and harvesting plants and bringing them into the kitchen. And, as chefs, we can be making our own spices and making things taste like where we happen to live, like because we can just utilize things that's part of our natural world and mimic a lot of the flavors that our ancestors might have been utilizing, but we can reinvent them. We're not, again, like we're not trying to cook in the past. We're just trying to cook healthy, beautiful food that has a lot of intention and story to tell, and utilizing and creating dishes that speak of very specific spaces, and just utilizing ingredients that we can stand in one spot and look around and find all these things. Like this is rabbit, cedar, wild rice, maple, cranberry. And out here in Minnesota, we could just look around and see those things in the forests and the lakes, right? And keeping things really simple and just really working to try and get this food into indigenous communities where it suffers, where they suffer a lot because of food access. I don't think I have to tell you guys what the statistics on places like Pine Ridge are like when it comes to diets and the foodborne illnesses that are out there because of the food access. But we really need to work to try and get this food out there. And there's definite ways we can do this, and we want to push a lot of the power of this food into the tribes. So it's not just about finding people to supply the tribes with this food, but get the tribes to want to create their own systems, to grow their own food, to train the next generation of chefs and cooks to be able to make this food possible, and to create an economy within and a skill set within to be able to make sure that we're able to do that. So our vision is through our nonprofit NATIFS, which is North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems, with the two goals of just creating access to Indigenous education and stewarding it through a lot of videos, and creating access to our Indigenous foods by popularizing it. We created a brand called Indigenous Food Lab, which we have active here in Minneapolis, Minnesota, which is a place that we can train. And so we have a market space where we've brought in over 60 different Indigenous food producers right now. We have a production kitchen where we're making lots of food products. We have an education studio. We're recording lots of videos. If you go to natives.org, you can find a lot of those videos and you can share them. And we also we're creating more Indigenous food service concepts. So the market plays as a place where not only can people come and buy this food, but they can order it online. We're creating all sorts of education for people to utilize in school systems and whatnot, just so we can have Indigenous perspective education out there. And then we're also, I'm gonna skip this. That's a video, but you can go to our website to look for that. We also just prioritize purchasing from Indigenous first, because it's one thing to make Indigenous recipes, but if we're just buying those foods from a Walmart or Costco or US Foods or whatever, Cisco, like we need to be making sure we're prioritizing purchasing products from Indigenous communities too. And we want to show people a path of how that's possible. And I just think there's so much opportunity for creating a whole new generation of Indigenous foods out there. So we're not stuck with just fry bread. Not that there's anything wrong with fry bread, but we all know it's not very healthy for us. And it's also something that doesn't really belong to us. It shouldn't identify all of us as Indigenous peoples across the board when we have so much beautiful diversity. And it's totally possible to come up with all sorts of amazing food brands and operations out there, which we've been working on over years. The restaurant Awamni in Minneapolis, we won Best Restaurant in the entire nation by the James Beard Award Foundation, which is a huge award because it's a national award, and showcasing that it was popular to create a restaurant without ranch dressing and be able to pull that off. Um, we also talk about just the need for more permaculture and community gardens and just getting these foods out there. And just like I tell people all the times that lawns are stupid because they are. They're kind of a waste of space, and we should just be putting food plants everywhere. And I make fun of places like Palm Springs because they have 120 golf courses in the middle of the desert. And if we have that ability, then we should be doing that for food and water conservation and not just making places for golfers to golf. We just bought a new building in Minneapolis that we're calling Woyite Tipi, which is a Dakota Lakota word. It translates loosely to food building. Everybody knows what a teepee is, and Woyite basically means food. And what we're doing with this, we have a new restaurant concept that we're opening up, which is just a piece of it called Shota, which is part of the word Minnesota, because in the Dakota language, Mini Shota Makoche, it means the place where the clouds live in the water or the smoky water, but it refers to the reflections of the clouds in the water, since we have, nearly 15,000 lakes here in Minnesota. But it's a indigenous barbecue concept we're opening up that's a little lower price point than our other restaurant. And we're going to be able to do a lot. But what we're mostly excited about is we're basically just making this the center point of all the work that we do, because the back of that kitchen at that new building, we're moving into institutional food support. So we're going to be making large format foods for schools and hospitals. So instead of trying to train all of their chefs and cooks to make healthy indigenous foods for themselves, we just want to utilize the model that's already out there, which is they're basically just buying all this food from Aramarks and Cisco's and Sodexo's, and they're just heating things up to serve to their kids. So we're just going to create a model where we can just be a culturally specific food manufacturing facility and probably making about 15 to 25,000 servings a day out of whichever recipes we're building. And that way we can freeze those and send them out so people could just heat them up and serve them basically. So this will support, for us, the wide area around us. We've actually been working with Red Cloud School for the past few years too on Pine Ridge, but we should be able to start serving this food, shipping this food directly to tribal communities everywhere. And we are replicating all of our models, with Indigenous Food Lab and restaurants. So basically, we're going to be replicating that. We're moving into Bozeman, Montana this year. We've been working on that for a few years now, but we're basically going to replicate what we've created in Minnesota by utilizing a kitchen to create large format institutional foods to send out to schools, hospitals, tribal communities, universities, colleges, whatever, just to start to normalize having options for healthy Indigenous foods out there. We're not trying to take over the whole lunch programs, but just create offerings of healthy Indigenous foods, also making sure that each recipe has an Indigenous ingredient in it. So some of that food dollar is going back to Indigenous food production. Behind Montana, we're looking at possibly moving into Rapid City, into Anchorage, Alaska, and into North Carolina, into the Durham area. And eventually, we want to open up more of these. We want to keep replicating, and we can create center points all over the United States. Eventually, we can cross the colonial borders, and we can be in other parts. We can be up in Canada, down in Mexico, and beyond that. So this is a lot of the work that we do. Is we just see an opportunity to really tap into Indigenous communities and knowledge on a global scale to see how we could be more, just environmentally minded of what's around us, and how we can push away from a lot of the colonial mindset that we've been kind of that's been normalized in our lifetimes, of just how we prioritize money and profit over people and community and health. And we need to start to change that mindset and really start to center ourselves more on humanity, no matter where we may be in the world. And we just see a massive opportunity for Indigenous peoples to tap into tourism, to be able to really boost a lot of their Indigenous food system works, and just be able to really be a massive voice across the world of how we can live better and closer to the earth and eat healthier, and hopefully inspire a new generation of people to be able to do that. All right. So that's like the half hour version of a normally 1 hour talk. And so there's a lot of stuff I usually talk about, in those hour long talks, but that's a very quick version of it. So I just wanted to try to get through that as quickly as possible so you could kind of see the message that I give to people, but also a little bit of the work that we do. And now we have plenty of time for a little bit of questions. And I'm happy just to have a conversation with you guys to see what we could do to help move forward. But hopefully that, shines a little bit of light on some of what we do and why we believe it's extremely important, especially to get this food into Indigenous communities.
Well done, Sean. Thanks for
Yeah.
you really condensed a lot in a
Well,
short amount of time.
Right.
Um, yeah, thanks for doing that. And
Absolutely.
yeah, so I'm just going to open it up to the floor. My first question is, did anybody see any opportunities for your organization when you were listening to some of that? I'll highlight some of mine, but I'll let you guys go first.
I think for YFS, so I work with kids on a daily basis in the garden, but there's a lot of foods that I would like to teach them how to make, or for them to learn how to make, but I want them to be indigenous foods or foods that are close to their heart. And so I guess what I was thinking was inviting experts, natives, in to come help cook things or learn how to make meals.
Yeah, and we have connections of people who are out there, people on Pine Ridge and Rosebud, and we have people within our own community, and our own organization even that do a lot of that. And of course, like just look through our videos to see some fun stuff that you might be able to do with the kids too, using indigenous ingredients. Because we have quite a few videos up from last year, and we're just going to be keep creating more this year. And as we start to expand outwards, every location will be doing more videos too.
Okay.
And and we use so I have a cookbook out that's been out since 2018 or whatever, but it's called the Sous Chef's Indigenous Kitchen. So we utilize that for a lot of education too. And we have a tribal discount, so we can sell it to entities or nonprofits at a lower rate so they can use it for education also. And then this year in November, I have a new cookbook coming out called Turtle Island, which looks at all of North America from Mexico through Alaska, showcasing all of that diversity. And so that's a really big one, but that won't be out until November.
I believe we used your cookbook to make wasabi.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah.
We're also planning to plant an indigenous demonstration garden at our farm because so many of the children that we serve are indigenous, and it's to recognize the sophistication of indigenous knowledge and create pride, not create, but it's internal, but just give them something to be very proud of.
Absolutely. Yeah, and just being able to see that, we've created all these chefs here in Minneapolis that are growing and thriving with indigenous foods, and we have a lot of followers, we get a lot of attention, and it's just we just want to be inspiration for the younger generation to see that there's a big world out there that food could really benefit us, and there's a lot to learn and to continue to grow, and we're just trying to open up doors and kind of, hopefully the next generation can take it even further than we can. But but we're very close to seeds, so if you guys need indigenous seeds particularly, we can connect you with some groups to be able to do some of that stuff because we just see a massive need to steward a lot of those heirloom varieties out there.
We have a planning committee that's mostly indigenous because I didn't want to do the planning for an indigenous garden. And we're getting together in a week or so for a dinner and a planning session. I'm really looking forward to getting that going in the spring.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Karen, did you have any thoughts?
Um, a couple of thoughts I had is just as kind of a recipient of all those email newsletters. Uh, in addition to the cookbooks, I think a couple of email newsletters that caught my eye was there was a list of like indigenous recipes made with commodity foods. And I think this year there was one like how to indigenize your holiday meal.
Right.
So I really like those in the sense that it's like if you could go full bore and have all these indigenous ingredients, that's one thing. But there's a spectrum, and you don't have to, go 100% on the ingredients. You know,
Yeah.
there are other activities you can try. And I would say different levels of convenience and accessibility. So I thought those were really cool.
Yeah, no, there was a lot of fun. That was a project we did with USDA of just taking a lot of those commodity food programs and helping them to create regional recipes that people could think about to kind of make things a little bit more regional, but still utilizing the foods that are being handed out. And eventually, hopefully, we can start to change some of the ingredients that are coming through commodity foods by, having more regional indigenous products in some of those offerings. And so it's not just all the normal stuff that you see at the grocery store, but things that are actually native products. And so I think again, there's a lot of opportunity for food distribution, for food manufacturing amongst indigenous foods, which what we're slowly crawling into. And so we're just going to keep working towards that. And the more we normalize having native foods out there, not just on Thanksgiving time, but throughout a yearly basis and utilizing a lot of the native languages too. So we've given a lot of recipes to Red Cloud School in Pine Ridge over the past few years, a couple of years at least, and doing a lot of that where we're trying to utilize some of the basic commodity pieces that they have, but also adding things to it to make something that's a little bit more indigenous, and putting it in their language. So utilizing Lakota out there to attach it to that, so they can feel proud of these foods, because we're unfortunately not used to these indigenous foods yet. We call it ironically foreign, but it's literally the food of where we're from, and there's a lot of work to do to try to normalize this food to get it out there, and it's going to take some time because it's not as addictive as something with lots of fat and salt and sugar that you might get at a grocery store or gas station, but it's also something that has a lot of meaning. So if we can get the message across of why this food is important and get kids to feel how do you feel after you have this food compared to if you ate something not so great from a gas station, that
Hello.
hopefully people will want to eat healthier.
Oh, I'm on a Zoom meeting. Can I give you a call back in a few minutes?
Oh,
Okay, thanks.
yeah. And I think my attitude, which, may be mirrored by other people, is, I really like next steps. Like, say we're on step one, and what are some possible steps 2 and 3? And what I see is like this huge, beautiful mountaintop, but I'm really not quite sure, what steps I can take towards that mountaintop. We might have a lot of brain freeze on, you know, yeah. How do we find a path or start a path to get towards that mountaintop when step one seems to be very unrelated or something that we can't visualize?
Well, part of what we're hoping is
Yeah.
if we can find a space and some people to partner with in Rapid City, because I'd love to do this work out there since that's where I grew up. And
Mhm.
basically, the process that we would have would be we would find a space that could have a small restaurant. So, because just imagine, like, if we had a native restaurant in Rapid City or in Custer or in Deadwood, even someplace that's touristy, or even one of the National Park Service places, like even right on Mount Rushmore or some Keystone or something. But anyways, like put a restaurant somewhere where people can come and celebrate, and you could create a lot of jobs for Indigenous youth. We can move a lot of native food product through there, and it could just be a place where people can experience what it's like to have native food, because that's just typically not out there at all. You might find a bison burger or an Indian taco out there in some of the touristy spaces, but nothing that has anything to do with really the culture. So we want to utilize restaurants as a place where people can learn and grow, and it can always create jobs for people to utilize, right? And you can rely on the tourism to keep it open, because it would be harder to put just a native restaurant on Pine Ridge, for example, because restaurants are a privilege because you need money to go to a restaurant. Not a lot of
Mhm.
people have money to spend at a restaurant. So we utilize the restaurant as a different kind of tool. It's one that creates jobs, and it's one that builds skills, and it's one that moves food product through. So it kind of becomes an engine to move a lot of this food product. And then we can open up distribution. And if we open up a kitchen facility to just create, like what we're doing in Minnesota, a lot of the institutional foods, like say we opened up an institutional food place right on Pine Ridge somewhere, it could be on the reservation. You can create a lot of jobs for people to make, a few thousand meals a day that could be utilized in schools and the hospital and all those kinds of things, or community centers. Or you can do this someplace centralized in South Dakota and send it to all of the reservations if you wanted to. But you could create a lot of food just to cover a lot of those food needs and start to normalize having that healthy food out there. And a lot of the private schools, or a lot of the public schools, even have the ability on the tribal communities, because we have this local food procurement act that's still in play right now, where they can decide if they want to bring in some of these outside foods and not just be stuck with completely with the USDA requirement. Some of this will rely on some funding, of course, but the states could put a lot of money into effort, because we should be investing into health. We should be investing in food system and water conservation, because that's the health of our next generations, and that's what this is all really about. And so that's part of that model. But and then just opening up a lot of education and places to steward a lot of the knowledge out there, to create more education. Like when we opened up our restaurant Awamni in Minneapolis, it's a park board officially owns property, but we were able to work with them, and when they redid the park, we had them put only indigenous plants in. And then around with those plants that they put in, we put little placards so it'll show the true native name of that plant first. So it's in Dakota language there because that's the true name of that plant in that soil. And then it'll have an English descriptor of what that plant has been used for and can still be used for today. So it's just kind of like passive education of what's just around us, of just walking around and seeing all these little placards of native knowledge kind of all over the landscape, right? So there's plenty of opportunity for indigenous knowledge, and especially right where you are in the Black Hills, there's still so much Lakota knowledge alive that's just not part of the curriculums. And there's a lot that we can bring back, even because there's just a lot of plant knowledge and animal knowledge, and there's a lot of resourcefulness of how we utilize everything. Because, like, we live in a society where we just create so much trash all the time because that's just what we're good at. But, for indigenous communities, like, that wasn't an option. We didn't have that privilege. We learned from countless generations of how to utilize every part of a bison or any animal we broke down, and also plant pieces. What do we do with everything? We weren't creating waste, we were creating things that helped us. And so there's just a better way to look at the world and the plants in that situation, and to show the value of indigenous peoples, because obviously racism is still a massive issue out there, especially in places like Rapid City, unfortunately, because it is because and again, but if you see, like, why do we have racism? Why do we have this situation happening? We can see ways to bring us together, and food is that common language that we share. So if we started to really tap into native knowledges and native foods and share it, people would have a little bit more understanding of what's happening there in around that area, and anywhere you choose, really.
I have a question about whether you think it may be useful to approach some existing, I would call them like artisan restaurants, and have them put a couple menu items on their menu that had indigenous food. So you didn't start off with an indigenous restaurant. But for me, having lived in California for 40 years, 20 of them in San Diego recently, the restaurant scene here, I'm just like, oh, like it's a gut buster, you know. But there are
a lot of meat and potatoes out there.
yeah, but there are, so I because I'm a foodie, I figured it out, here's the authentic taco shack and here's the this and that.
Yeah.
And there are a couple coffee shops, and there's the Sour, which is a bakery that do work on selling, I would consider artisan foods,
Right.
more quote exotic ingredients, and maybe it would be worth it to talk to them. I know the Sour just made it on the list of the New York Times of 25 best bakeries in the U.S.
Beautiful.
And they like incorporating fusion. And since I've been really spoiled about living in California, like, I don't like fusion because I can go directly to the ethnic group and eat their food. But maybe that is also a place to look into.
Yeah, I mean, I think
So an introduction through
that.
an established restaurant or bakery.
Yeah, and I think part of that is just getting them to buy some of these indigenous products, and
Mm-hmm.
trying to completely culturally appropriate, to say, like, we're just making all native food now, but to say,
Yeah,
we're buying this amazing native product, featuring it, and telling the story of that producer
right,
possibly.
right.
So
Yeah,
there's really good ways to be able to utilize these, because we want to see more usage of native products out there, but we also do want to shy people away from just co-opting it and then
right,
culture appropriating and
right.
trying to make money off of somebody's culture, but to
Yeah,
actually, like, celebrating it and
yeah.
paying homage to it.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else have any comments? Lisanne, do you have any thoughts? Does anybody in the room here want to speak? The speaker can hear you.
I guess I have a question or two. First, thank you so much. Everything you've said is just really a lot of the ways that I've felt and have a really hard time articulating, and kind of, going to school where I go to school, but also being where I'm from, it's kind of hard to live in this middle ground. And so I
Mhm.
think you've just done a really beautiful job of like merging those two worlds. So my first question is actually about you talked about growing indigenous, having what were they called? The seeds,
Mhm.
having these seeds and them being native to these certain areas, do you have information or where you can find information of what seeds were traditionally grown in certain areas and what would maybe be best specifically for the Rapid City area?
Yeah, I mean, because the agricultural history in South Dakota is pretty amazing because of the Missouri River Valley. So a lot of the tribes growing up and down the Missouri River there with the Hidatsa, Riccara, Mandan, that there's just a lot of cool seeds that have actually been saved from those particular cultures. A lot of it came out of North Dakota from a seed company in the late 1800s called I think George Wills was his name. But basically, I think it was the Wills. Maybe it was I can't remember if it was like the George Wills Seed Company or something. But like, anyways, like he started working with a lot of the native farmers around the Missouri River Valley, and because of that seed collection, we still have a lot of amazing seeds from the Mandan, Arikara, and Hidatsa. And the Lakota moved around a little bit more. They weren't the agriculture wasn't the biggest piece for them because they became horse culture, they moved really far and they stretched out, from everywhere from Minnesota out to the Bighorns, basically, right? And down to Colorado and up into North Dakota, Montana. And so they moved around quite a bit, but they took over a massive land space of Central America, which is right where you guys live today. But there's still a lot of cool seeds, and there are some Lakota seeds out there. There's still a Lakota squash that's really beautiful. But there's just a lot of cool different varieties of corns and beans and squash and sunflowers that come from those particular tribes along the Missouri River Valley. And that's just that region, but then you see more seeds going out towards the East Coast and all the way down, into Mexico. So there are a lot of seeds out there. There are a lot of indigenous seed keepers. And there is that book out there called Buffalo Bird Woman's Garden, which you can find. It's really easy, but it's such a beautiful depiction because it's written for her, but it's her memories, so she grows up a young Hidatsa woman, farming the way they always had before European influences and talking about how they laid out their village and their farm. And so it's a really unique perspective of indigenous agriculture in the Dakotas and especially along the Missouri River. But it's also really unique because it comes from a female voice, and female voices never make it through history, especially if they're a female of color on top of that.
Thank you. That was a great answer. Thank you so much. The one other question I had was because of how you were talking about how a lot of our world is not from an indigenous perspective and a lot of our values are not indigenous values, meaning like health and that type of thing is not the forefront of people's minds. Usually it's money and stuff like that. So how are you able to deal with the challenges of the costs of using local farmers and indigenous farmers and stuff like that, rather than, these huge corporations that are able to produce their food because of very, very low cost, low quality, like all of these things. How do you deal with those challenges and how do you get people to kind of overcome that?
I think that's where some of the restaurants come into play because we're putting restaurants in places where they can charge, decent amounts of money for the food that they serve. So nicer restaurants. And because our restaurant in Minneapolis, it's a part of our nonprofit, because again, we use it for job creation and for product movement and to create an experience for people. And it builds skills for the workers too. And so that's a big part of it is that because we can charge more for the dishes that we create, we can pay really nice prices to these indigenous producers and pay them for the specialty product that they're growing. So they're not trying to compete with some of these GMO farmers that are just trying to pump out massive amounts of preset prices of foods, And so we want to showcase how these are very special and how they should have a little bit higher price tag on them so that money goes back into those food producers so they can continue to grow more. And so that's why restaurants are another big piece of that. But I think the institutional food will be a big component to this because if we can create recipes using some of those products, then that's when we really move a lot of food because like our restaurant, we can only do 500 people a day maximum if we're really busy. And then whereas an institutional food kitchen, like we could be producing 20,000 meals a day out of just, making a few recipes, but just think about how much food that is that you're utilizing to make that happen.
Right. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I also have a quick question. So I'm
Mhm.
wondering, like, if you've faced any resistance to your advocacy and how you combated that, because like as the committee moves forward into advocating for local and sustainable foods in our area? Like, how can we combat any potential resistance to our efforts?
I think food is something that just everybody needs. So I just try to speak very plainly. The histories aren't very pleasant to learn about or to even know about sometimes, but it's just part of our history. Like you can try to ignore the history or change it, but it doesn't change it. It's still there. You know what I mean? And all of this breakdown of trying to erase Black and Indigenous histories in different parts of America, like doesn't make any sense because it's just a part of our histories. And the more we know history, the better we are for it. So I think, for me as an advocate, like I'm not afraid just to talk about things that are just true and facts. There's nothing wrong with that. And so history, you just lay history out for the facts and you paint a picture as to why things are the way they are today. But it's also challenging us to like we can do better. Like we can actually change things to be better. We can be more inclusive. We can understand and celebrate diversities and try to homogenizing things and trying to be afraid, especially of people of color. We should be all coming together to learn that we have immense value, and we shouldn't be doing these racial divisions out there at all because it doesn't help anybody. And so I think it's really important just to be bold with the message that you choose to show. But really the important for me, like my center is just food. We just want to get healthier food out there and everybody could appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you.
I just want to say one thing that popped into my mind that I'm not sure all of you are aware of. And sorry, the sun is doing some weird things. Um, a few years ago, this is kind of local related, Rapid City, Mayor Allender and the council at the time hired a group of people. There were some archaeologists and various people to do like a native history of the Rapid City area. And they gave a really cool presentation at the city council meeting. So if anybody's curious about that, look that up and check it out. And I love this idea of having some kind of a native restaurant. And I think a lot of that work that those archaeologists, and there were some other native leaders that were involved in that effort, that information is there. We've done the homework. They put a really nice presentation together. And I love the idea of bringing people in with food and then teaching them about our history, local
Because we
history
have
here.
a lot of people that come to our restaurant, and there's a lot of people that travel to Minnesota just to visit our restaurant, even. And we see that every single day because we've been sold out since we opened 3.5 years ago, every single
Wow.
night. And so that's a really, so our restaurant's a success, but it's a really important thing because it's just something different to showcase. Like these are just the true food and flavors of this land that we're sitting on, and we're using a lot of wild food and wild game and birds and fish and things. And over half the menu is plant-based because, we're not putting butter and cheese in everything. So it's just so there's a lot of opportunity for utilizing native restaurant concepts. And that's something that we could support with our native nonprofit. It's something I can consult with and help people just grow through a for-profit arm. But either way, like we just want to see more native restaurants out there. There's really no reason not to have them, not only to benefit the indigenous communities for them to be proud, but for other people to have that experience and to, again, use them to divert money to programming.
Yeah, I mean, Sean, you're doing it. Karen kind of challenged me through this little, you reaching out to you. And one of the things I noticed she said in her initial email was, let's do something. And I really love a lot of the things that you put up on the screen for us today. It's a challenge for us. And
Yeah.
I talk to a lot of tourists that come through Rapid City and say, where can I get some indigenous food? Like, and they just think, people just say, oh, Indian taco.
Yeah.
Where's the best Indian taco? And so the demand is there. Yeah, we all know it. So.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I was born and raised there. I grew up on Pine Ridge, but I lived in Spearfish from like junior high through college age, so I just know that area. It's home to me. So,
Yeah, yeah, what a resource. So you all have my email that you got in the invite and I think various other ones on here. I'll put some notes together of what I scribbled down just so that people have our perspective anyway. And my main reason for sending out notes for this is to keep in touch. I hope this is just the first of many conversations.
sure.
Does anybody have any parting thoughts?
I'm going to take a self-appointed action item and those lists of those recipes that I mentioned. I have emailed them out before, so I'll try to forward them. So for groups that are interested, I'll have the list of the recipes that were provided before.
And all we're trying to do is just become a support system, so we want to just help things go and we can work with other people, but whatever initiatives are out there, you know, finding resources and spaces we can support with anything that comes with Indigenous culinary, you know, and we obviously have resources for education too, but we just really, you know, we can help people develop menus, recipes, concepts, all those kinds of things. We can find some investors if we needed to go that route, or we could just find some nonprofit resources to build some of these entities out, you know, but it could be really beneficial and impactful to have more of these kinds of programmings out there. And just thinking about like how are we tapping into tourism and what is the message that we're giving them, you know, because it's not just about guts and borglum. It should really there should be a lot more storytelling about the Lakota, which you don't find out there in tourism spaces.
Great. Sean, I'm just curious, on a personal note, have you gone to or heard of Cafe Aloni in Berkeley?
Yeah.
Because I know you support Wapapa's Kitchen.
Yep, I know those guys well. We've done some work together. We've done some big dinners like
Mhm, mhm.
um,
And
known them over the
yeah,
years. Yeah.
if you ever feel like making your way to Tahiti, I was there in November.
Oh, nice.
There's a chef and food advocate on Mo'orea, which I told him about you.
Cool.
So they
Well,
have a restaurant named Maru Maru, which is uh, indigenized ingredients, fine dining.
good.
So there's
Yeah,
a
because we've been
sprout there
working with
too.
a lot of people in Hawaii, especially
Mhm,
on Oahu, and we're going to continue to grow that out there. We see a lot of opportunity out there, but we've also been connecting with people in New Zealand and other places
mhm.
in the South Pacific. But there's just, again, on a global scale, there's immense opportunity for Indigenous peoples to really connect with their roots and to really highlight it and showcase it. And, you know, there's just a big world out there. And, but again, like we all have to work together as humans and we have to understand that as humans, like we can connect with each other and we don't have to be scared of each other. We should learn from each other and grow with each other. So we do really have to really focus on how do we center towards humanity. And that's a big part of this whole story, you know.
Yeah.
Thank
Well,
you.
thank you. Thank
Yeah,
you very much for the presentation and thank you for your time and being willing to meet with us. And
absolutely. My pleasure.
I sure hope that beautiful things come from this. So thank
Yeah.
you everyone for
Just reach
attending.
out anytime, you know how to find me. So
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
thank you guys. Appreciate it.
Thank
Have a
you.
good day.
Bye bye.